What's up, fellow Polymaths? In this video of the Java Fundamentals tutorial, we'll be going over decision statements. Decision statements, also called control flow statements, represent how the Java code is able to execute. Java, like most programming languages, is executed from top down. Loops and decision statements can alter the flow of control so that statements are repeated and or skipped entirely. If statements are Boolean statements used to execute code if the condition is true. Otherwise, the code in the if condition is skipped. And the syntax for the if condition is basically the if word, and then in parentheses, you'll input the condition. And then in this block of code, if the condition is true, if this if statement condition is true, then the code gets executed. Otherwise, it gets ignored. Else statements are optional in an if statement, but must always be executed last. You can think of else statements as the last decision to make. If the if statement condition is not true, then the else condition will always be executed. And the syntax is similar to the if condition, except instead of just having an if, you also had an else condition after the brackets. And just like the if condition, the else condition, the code in the else condition gets executed if the if condition is not true. If else if statements, are also called elif statements, are only executed if the first condition is false. You can have as many else if statements as you want, though depending on how many you have, a better alternative would be to use a switch statement. And similar to if else statements, you have an if condition, and then you'll have a else if condition afterwards, and then you have an else condition after the else if statement. And as I mentioned before, you can have as many else if statements as you want, but it's best to only have what's necessary. If you have a bunch of else if statements, then it's better to use a switch statement. Nested statements are used when you have an if condition inside another if condition. Sort of like the movie Inception, except instead of dreams, it's if conditions. Like the movie, you don't want to get too carried away with having a bunch of nested if statements unless there isn't a way around it. Ternary operators are also called conditional operators. There are three operands that are used to evaluate whether the expression is true or false. The syntax is where we have a variable and we check if it's equal to a certain condition with the question mark afterwards. If the first condition is true, that first value gets assigned. Otherwise, the other value is assigned. Switch statements are an alternative way to an if statement that can be used to execute one of many blocks of code. Switch statements are an alternative to an if statement that can be used to execute one of many blocks of code. The switch statement is executed once, which then checks each block of code in the switch statement. If the condition of the block is true, that code gets executed. To exit off a switch statement, you can use the break statement. It's good practice, though not required, to have a break statement after executing the block of code, unless you have a good reason not to have one. Break statements are used to break out of a switch statement or other loops, such as while loops, do while loops, and for loops. You can think of break statements as a referee blowing their whistle after some condition during play has happened, like a foul or end of a period. If none of the code in the switch condition is true, then you can, though not required, have a default statement. You can think of the default statement as some generic code which executes after you have exhausted all the options in the switch statement. And here's the syntax for the switch statement. So we have our switch keyword as well as the condition, similar to the if statement. And then each switch condition is going to have a case, which that case contains a variable. And within that case contains a block of code. And then we break out of the case. Then we optionally break out of the case. And then there's a default, which is optional, which executes a block of code if none of the cases have been executed. So I know I've been explaining quite a bit and you're probably bored with my explanation. So let's just go into the code and then test all these. All right, so we're in the code right now. Let's test out the if statement first. All right, so I just created a basic if statement right now. Basically, it's checking if the year of birth is less than the Y2K variable. And then if so, we're going to be executing that statement. So let's test that out right now. So here in the command line, it's clear that the if condition was true because the print line statement was able to be executed. So basically it's checking if the year of birth is less than Y2K, which it is, and because it is, we executed this print line statement, you were born before the year 2000. So now that we've tested if statements, let's test out an if else statement. All right, so I added an else statement to this. If the if condition is not true, then the else condition will be output, and then it'll say you were born after the year 2000. So let's test that out right now. All right, so the initial if condition is true. It still says you were born for the year 2000. So let me change this year of birth to 2001, and then we can see what it says. All right, so because we changed the value of the year of birth, it now says you were born after the year 2000. So now that we've tested if-else statements, let's test the if else if and else statement. All right, so I've added the else if statement to our if else statement. I also changed the value of the year of birth from 2001 to 2000. So now that I've done this, let's run the code. All right, so our output is you were born in the year 2000. So let's see what's happening right here. So we have our year of birth, which is 2000, and the Y2K, which is 2000 as well. So in this first if condition, it checks if the year of birth is less than the Y2K. Y2K and the year of birth are the same. This if condition is going to be evaluated as false. So then we move on to this else if condition right here, and it checks if the year of birth is equal to Y2K. Because remember, the equals in Java is the double equal sign, whereas the one equal represents an assignment. So here it just checks if the year of birth is equal to Y2K, and because both values are the same, it will output this statement, you were born in the year 2000, and then it will ignore any condition afterwards. All right, now that we tested if, else if, and else statements, let's test out nested statements. All right, so I added a nested statement inside our else if statement. I added the month of birth variable, which is an integer. So the nested statement inside the else if condition is just asking what range of the month of birth that we were born in, if we were born between January and June or after June. All right, so let's run the code now, and I'll explain what's happening. All right, so in our decision statement, we see that the else if condition was executed. And then in our else if condition, we see that it prints out you were born in the year 2000. So below that, we have our nested if condition. So in nested if condition, it checks if the month of birth is greater than or equal to 1, and the month of birth is less than or equal to 6. So basically, if it's born between January or June. And if it is, then if the person is born between January and June, then we output that they were born inclusively between January and June. Else, if they weren't born between January and June, so basically if the month of birth is not less than 6, then we output the statement, you're born after June 30th in the year 2000. And in our output, we get you were born inclusively between January and June. So now that we've tested if statements, else if statements, if else if statements, and nested statements, let's test out ternary operators. All right, so I created some simple code for the ternary operator. So let's run this code and I'll explain what's happening. We were able to execute the code and we're able to get a result. So this by the game question is marked as true. So basically what's happening on line 7, we have a variable called price of new game set as 50, and it doesn't matter what the currency is. On line 8, we have a Boolean called by the game condition, and then it's checking if the price of the new game is less than or equal to 60. So if the price of the new game variable is less than or equal to 60, then that condition will be assigned as true. Otherwise, that variable will be assigned as false. So because of the price of the new game is less than 60, we assign this condition as true, and that means this by the game Boolean variable is also assigned as true. So now that we have tested out ternary operators, let's test out switch statements. All right, so I created the switch statement. So this switch statement is just checking what the month of the year is, and then outputting it to the command line. So let's run this code, and I'll explain what's happening. All right, so here in the command line, it outputs the month of February, since currently at this moment in time, we're in the month of February. Basically what's happening here is I created an integer variable called month, and it's assigned as a calendar.month. So this calendar borrows from the java.util calendar class, and this month is an enumerator that checks for the specific month of the year. So here in the switch statement, I pass in the month variable, and this month variable, which by the way is the value is 2, basically used to check the condition if any of the cases in the switch statement are valid. So here we have case 1, and remember this 1 represents the value, not the actual case number. So cases can also contain strings as well if, for example, you're trying to test a string out instead of a number. So just keep that in mind. So we hit this case and it checks if the value is 1, and since it's not, it won't output this condition. So then we check the case 2. Now we know that the month value is 2 because it's February currently. And then since the value is 2, it'll output this statement February, as you see in the command line. So after that, it breaks out of this switch statement, which ends the switch statement. So basically all these other cases after don't get executed because we broke out that switch statement. So now that we've done that, let's set the value of the month to something that wouldn't be qualified for any of these cases that we've assigned. So basically, let's say 9, for example. All right, so let's run this right now. So now we see here it says you were born after July. So now that we look at this, we see that none of these cases qualify for our switch statement. So it goes to the default. And the default is basically a generic code that's executed if none of the cases qualify. So it outputs this print line since none of the cases qualify. So that's pretty much a quick example of switch statements. We went over quite a bit, so just try to take a deep breath, but also play around with if statements, else if statements, if else if statements, ternary operators, and switch statements. They're very useful and you use them a lot, especially with things such as gaming, enterprise production applications, and so on. All right, here's our assignment for this topic. Number 1, true or false. Java programs are executed from the bottom up. Number 2, write an if statement that checks if the person is over 18 and outputs that they are eligible to vote. Number 3, write an if else statement that checks the above but also outputs if they are not eligible to vote. Number 4, write an if else statement that checks what a person's favorite color is. The type of color doesn't matter. In the else statement, output that you're unsure what their favorite color is. Number 5, write a switch statement that checks what continent the user lives on, with a default message outputting that the person must live on the sea or in outer space. If this video was of any value to you, then please leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.